In this section, we're going to begin exploring how to add animations to our projects. Animations breathe life into any application. They're a great way to add pizzazz. They let the user know which parts of the app they can interact with. Whether you're adding a simple fade effect or a sophisticated slideshow, Vue is flexible enough to work with any type of animation. There are different ways to add animations. They usually fall into two categories, which are CSS animations and JavaScript animations. We'll be covering both. First, we'll start with CSS. There are two ways to add animations in CSS, which are through transitions and animations. We'll cover transitions since they're the simplest of the two. Before we get into the code, we have to understand the phases Vue will go through to add elements onto the page. Vue divides the animation into frames, which is how most animations are done. The first frame of the animation will have a class added to it called enterFrom. For example, if you call your animation fade, then the class name will be fadeEnterFrom. This class is removed after the first frame. It isn't alive for very long. Its purpose is to allow you to assign the element some initial properties. Along with adding a class at the beginning of the animation, Vue will add a class called Enter2. This class is added at the final frame of the animation. This class isn't commonly used, but it's useful if you want to add some finishing touches to the element after the animation is finished. The last class that's added is the EnterActive class. This class is added to the element from the beginning of the animation to the ending of the animation. This includes the first and final frames. With these three classes, we can accomplish a lot. Vue will take care of adding the classes for you. Enough theory, let's dig into the code. I'm inside a new project. It's based on the default project from the Create Vue package. I've emptied out the components directory. I've stripped the app component to its three blocks. Pause the video so you can have the same setup as me. Alternatively, you can download the project files in the resource section of this lecture. If you decide to do so, you will need to install the modules with the npm install command. In this example, we're going to show you how to animate an element when it's entering or leaving the document. We'll use a button to toggle the animation. Inside the template, we're going to add a h2 tag with some text inside. Right above it, we'll add the button for toggling the animation. To toggle the animation, we'll need to keep track of if the element should be on the page or not. We'll store it as a data property. Define the data function for the component. Inside the object, create a property called flag with the initial value of false. With a flag set, we'll add the vIf directive to the h2 tag. The expression will be set to the flag data property. This expression will make the element toggleable. It'll always remain hidden because the flag property is set to false. Therefore, we'll need a way to flip the value. We'll list for the click event on the button element. Create an expression that'll set the flag property to its opposite value. This expression is a very simple JavaScript trick to toggle the Boolean value of a variable. With that set, let's test if everything is working. Switch to the browser. Initially, the message won't appear. If we press the button, then the message will pop in since the flag property is set to true. We can continuously toggle the value without a problem. Pretty simple example, nothing we haven't seen before. The element rendering on the page is quick and snappy. It's fine, but we could definitely improve it by adding a smooth transition. I think that'll be nice. To add an animation to an element, you need to use a component called transition. Go back to the editor. Inside the app component, we'll wrap the heading element with the transition component. This component will add the classes I mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture. The classes will get applied to the elements inside the transition component, specifically the root element or the heading tag we're wrapping the component with. By default, Vue will start the class name with v. Therefore, The three classes I mentioned earlier will be vEnterFrom, vEnterActive, and vEnter2. Most of the time, you may want to give a more descriptive set of names, a name relative to the animation currently happening. To customize the name, you'll have to set the name property on the transition component. The value for this will be the custom name. We'll set this to Fade. The result of the class names will be vEnterFrom, vEnterActive, and vEnter2. The next step for us is to create the animation we want. Vue will not create the animations for us. It handles adding the classes whenever the element is toggled. Just because these classes are being applied to the element doesn't mean that an animation will automatically occur. We are responsible for taking it from there and specifying what will happen when these classes are applied. As the name suggests, we'll be adding a fade effect to the heading element. Inside the style block, we'll define the first class, vEnterFrom. This class is where you'll want to set the initial state of the element. This class gets added to the element when the element is entering the page. This class won't apply to elements that are leaving the DOM. There's another set of classes for that, but we'll get to those later. Adding a fade effect is simple. First, we have to make the element look invisible. We can use the opacity property and set it to 0. The opacity property will allow us to manipulate the opaqueness of an element. That's all we'll need to do for the initial phase. Next, we'll define the vEnterActive class. The EnterActive class is what's added for the entirety of the animation. This class is where we'll want to add the transition rules. We'll add the transition property with a value of all 0.25s linear. We won't bother with adding anything else. This property will create the fade effect we're seeking. We don't need to add the opacity property again because the default value for the opacity property is 1. 1 representing a fully opaque element. Since the vEnter class is removed after one frame, the browser's default CSS will get applied to the element. The opacity will transition from fully transparent to fully opaque. Let's give this a whirl. We'll refresh the page once more. Then we'll press the button again. As we press it, the element fades into view, which is what we wanted. However, it doesn't fade out. We're currently animating the element if it's entering the document. We haven't dealt with it when leaving the document. We'll have to add a different set of classes for when it's leaving. Vue will provide you with 3 classes. Instead of the keyword being enter, it's now leave. The leave_from class is added during the first frame of the animation. The leave_to class is added during the last frame of the animation. Lastly, the leave_active class is added during the entire animation, including the first and last frames. Once the animation is finished playing, the element is removed from the document. Adding these classes is pretty easy. We've already taken the first step to using them. The transition component will add the leave classes for you. It handles both entering and leaving transitions. The value in the name property will apply to leave classes. We can move right along to adding the styles. We'll add the selector fade leave in the style block. We'll set the transition to all .25s linear, same as above. In addition, we'll set the opacity to 0. We won't have to worry about the initial state of the element because most elements will have an opacity of 1 from the beginning. We need to take care of fading it out, which is what these 2 lines will accomplish. Let's refresh the page one more time and toggle the element. Both animations will work without a problem. This is the basics of using CSS transitions with Vue. There's one important point I want to highlight. It's not required to use every class available to you. Keep it simple and carefully think about what you're trying to accomplish. The classes are pretty clear, so you shouldn't have any problems with adding animation with CSS transitions. We'll leave it at that. I'll see you in the next one. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to configure transitions. There are various things we can change about transitions to get the desired behavior. If you look at our transitions, you'll notice that we didn't tell View how long each animation should play. View is capable of looking at the styles applied to the elements it's transitioning. In the styles, we set the duration of the component. View will use the duration you set in your CSS. It'll automatically pick up how long the transition will be. We don't have to worry about telling View when to add or remove the element. It'll take care of detecting when to add or remove elements appropriately. That's very convenient because it allows us to focus more on the animation rather than having to tell View everything. It is possible to set the duration explicitly by setting the duration property on the transition component. The value for the duration must be in milliseconds. View will prioritize the duration property over the duration in the CSS if it's defined on the component. We aren't going to set a duration, so we'll remove this property on the component. We're not limited using the vIf directive. Animations can be applied to elements using the vShow directive. Inside the template, we'll change this from vIf to vShow. Hopping back on over to the page, you'll see that the animation works without a problem. You're free to use either set of directives. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the View documentation on View's animations and transitions. The transition component is very flexible. Feel free to read the documentation when you completed this section of the course. The last thing I want to show you is that we're not limited to one root element. Let's go back to the editor. Inside the app component, we're going to add another heading tag. This element will have the vElse directive applied to it. We'll need to update the first heading to use the vIf directive for this to work. This directive is considered valid because the conditionals work alongside each other. This way, you're not forced to use multiple transitions. You can keep everything inside one transition. View will handle the rest. However, we do need to assist View a bit. View will have a bit of trouble differentiating between two elements even though there's a conditional directive applied to them. We need to add the key attribute to both elements with a unique value. We'll set the first heading to main. The second heading will be set to secondary. We previously learned about the key attribute when working with loops. It's an attribute that helps View keep track of elements. Switching back to the page, we can toggle between both elements with the transition in effect. This effect is almost perfect. You may not be able to notice the problem since the animation is going pretty fast. Therefore, we're going to switch back to the app component to update the enter and leave animations to a duration of 3 seconds. Switching back on over to the browser, you'll see that after pressing the button, the second heading animates in first. Afterward, the main heading animates out. After the main heading animates out, the secondary heading snaps to the top. This animation is great if that's the kind of animation you're looking for. If not, we may want to reverse this. You may want the element currently active to animate out first, and then the second element to animate in. By default, View will animate the second element in and animate the first element out. You can reverse this by setting the mode. Let's go back to the editor. On the transition component, we'll apply an attribute called mode set to out-in. This property will do what we want. The mode determines the order of the animation. By default, the value will be in-out, which means any elements that are entering the document will be animated first. It'll then proceed to animate elements that are leaving the document. By setting it to out-in, the reverse will happen. Elements that are leaving the document will be animated first, followed by elements that are entering the document. This value should give us the desired result. After refreshing the page, we should see the opposite of what was happening before. The element fades out and the other element fades in. We've made things look more consistent. That's great. This is the basics of using animations in View. In the next couple of lectures, we'll continue with animating in Vue with different techniques. CSS Transitions is one way to animate an element in Vue. Vue supports CSS animations, which are a more advanced way to animate elements. They give you more control over your animations. This isn't a CSS course, so I won't be diving too deep into the CSS syntax. We're going to comment out the first transition we created. We don't want it to bother us when working on a new transition. We're going to create another transition using CSS animations. To get started, we're going to add a new transition component. We'll place it below the first transition component in the template block. Inside of it, we'll be adding another heading with a basic message. We're going to add the name property with a value of zoom. We'll want to toggle the animation like last time. Let's apply the vIf directive to the heading element. We'll use the flag property to toggle the animation. We're going to make a zoom animation. Before we work on the animation, I want to add some styles to space out the headings. Inside the style block, select the heading. We'll set the width to 400 pixels. The padding and margin will be set to 20 pixels. While we're here, we're going to shorten the fade animation to last 1 second. 3 seconds is way too long. Next, let's work on the animation itself. We're going to create a zooming animation. If the element is entering the page, then it should zoom in. If the element is leaving, then it should zoom out. This effect can be done with transitions, but I want to show you how animations would work with Vue. At the bottom of the style block, we'll add the animation using the keyframes keyword. We'll call the animation zoom in. We'll keep the animation simple by using the from and to states. We won't bother with percentages. Inside the from block, we'll use the transform property to create the zooming effect. A zooming effect can be created using the scale CSS function. We'll scale the element to 0, 0. This value will make the element look invisible. It's not really. It's just been shrunken down to a very small size. Then, inside the to block, we'll set the scale back to 1, 1. This property will set the size back to what it was originally. This animation will give us the zoom effect we want. The zoom in animation is taken care of. Now we need to create the zoom out animation. We're going to create a copy of the zoom in animation. The animations are the same except in reverse. We don't need to rewrite the whole thing. We'll change the name to zoom out. We'll then switch the from and to states to get the opposite effect of the zoom in animation. The animations are set. The next step is to use them when Vue adds the classes to our elements. We're going to be using the same set of classes Vue has provided before. It's the exact same thing. Since the from and to states are set inside the keyframe, we don't have to rewrite the animation. Therefore, we can add the animations to the zoom enter active and zoom leave active classes. To add the animations, we need to use the animation property and pass in the animation name. For the enter animation, this will be zoom in. We're going to make the animation duration 1 second long with a linear speed curve. The mode will be set to forwards. By setting the mode to forwards, CSS will leave the element as is once the animation is complete. We don't want the animation to reset the scale to 0. Once again, Vue will be able to detect how long the animation should play by checking the duration you pass in the CSS. It'll appropriately add or remove the elements based on this value. We'll add the same set of properties to the zoom leave active class except with the zoom out animation. Let's give things a test. Back inside the browser, the heading shouldn't appear. After pressing the button, you'll see it zoom in or out depending on the current value of the flag property. View is able to detect the length of animation. It's able to correctly add or remove the element after the animation is complete. View can work with both transitions or animations. It can even work with both at the same time. Let's see what that looks like. Along with zooming in and out, we'll add a fade animation to the heading. Back inside the editor, we'll apply the transition property to both classes. The duration will be 1 second long. We'll set the opacity to 0 in the zoom, leave, and zoom enter classes. We won't be setting the opacity to 1 because that's the default value anyway. With that set, let's refresh the page and try pressing the button. The zoom and fade animations are being applied to the heading. This transition works fine, but there may be one problem you will run across when using both transitions and animations. If we look back at the code, you'll notice that both types of animations have the same duration, 1 second. What if we had two completely different durations? Update the transition to 2 seconds. By default, View will use the duration with the longest time. If possible, you want the duration in both properties to match. If necessary, View allows you to decide which duration to use. Inside the template block, we can add the type attribute to the transition component. The value for this can be either animation or transition. The value you pass in will tell View which duration it will use. Let's set this to animation. Since the animation is 1 second long, View will play the animation for 1 second. If other animations are playing on the same element, they won't finish if they play longer than 1 second. This is important to know if you plan on using a combination of CSS transitions and animations. We'll test this in one moment. There's one last thing I want to show you. Sometimes you may want to play the animation when the page loads. For example, in the data object, let's say I set the flag data property to true. This will mean that the element should appear on the page. However, if I were to switch back over the browser and refresh, you'll notice that the animations don't play. Instead, the elements just appear. It works, but it would be nice if the animation could play. We can override the default behavior by adding a property to the transition component called appear. Back in the editor, we'll add the appear property to the transition component. Switching back to the browser, the animation plays on the initial load. This animation is exactly what we wanted. The animation will play for 1 second. The zoom effect is what will last for 1 second while the fade effect lasts for 2 seconds. However, we never see the fade animation complete because the transition component is using the duration from the animation CSS property. We're finished reviewing CSS animations. You're free to use transitions, animations, or both. It's all preference. You have a variety of options at your disposal. CSS is usually the way to go when it comes to animating elements. It's the simplest way of adding animations. At times, you may need more control over the animation. In that case, controlling an animation with JavaScript might be what you need. Vue allows you to animate your elements with JavaScript. It doesn't take much work to get started. Vue will provide you with 3 hooks to use for both entering and leaving animations. The entering animations are used for when the element is being inserted into the DOM. There's the before enter hook, which is triggered before the animation starts. This hook allows you to prepare for anything you might need. Then there's the enter hook, which is where you would perform the animation itself. This hook is where most of your code will be written. Lastly, there's the after enter hook, which is called when the animation is finished. This allows you to do cleanup if necessary. The leaving animations are used for when an element is being removed from the DOM. You have the before leave hook, which is triggered before the animation starts. The leave hook is where you would perform the animation. Lastly, The after leave hook is used after the animation is complete. Let's explore how to create animations with JavaScript. We'll work in the app components again. I recommend commenting out the transition component we currently have in the document. We don't want it to bother us when working on JavaScript animations. First things first, we need to use the transition component. We'll add it below the other transitions. Inside this component, we'll add the usual heading with the flag conditional check. We want to animate the transition. This time we'll want to do it purely with JavaScript. We can use hooks to handle the animation with JavaScript. They can be added by adding event listeners to the transition component. Let's add those in quickly. To recap, the events are called before enter, enter, after enter, before leave, leave, and after leave. We can run some functions whenever these events are emitted. We're going to pass in some functions for each event. We'll receive an error because the functions are undefined. We'll add them soon enough. The events I'm showing you are the ones we'll primarily be working with. There are two additional events I didn't cover. They are called the canceled events. It is possible to cancel an animation. Similar to the enter and leave events, you can listen for when an animation is canceled. We'll listen for those events which are the enter canceled and leave canceled events. These events are canceled whenever their respective animations are canceled. Not often used, but they are available if you need them. We're going to remove them because we're not going to look at canceling animations at the moment. Let's define the functions that will run when the animation starts for both phases. Inside the component object, we'll define the methods property. Next, we're going to define each function inside the methods object. The function names should match the names you passed in the events inside the transition component. We will have a total of 6 functions. Each function is passed in an object called element. The element argument contains information about the element that is currently being animated. You have complete freedom to change any of the properties on this object. You'll need it if you want to apply your own animations. We'll accept this inside each function. There is one more argument we can add. The parameter I'm about to introduce can only be used in 2 of the 6 functions. They would be the enter and leave functions. Both functions must accept in the done argument. The done argument we're being passed in is a function. You're meant to perform the animation in both functions, but Vue won't know when your animation is complete. The done function is a callback function that will tell Vue that the animation is finished playing. After this function has been called, Vue will proceed with adding or removing the element. You must call this function, or else Vue won't be able to do its job properly. We're going to call this function in both hooks. Our other functions are empty. Let's log a message in each of them with the element parameter. These long statements will let us know when the functions run. Switching over to the browser, we will see the heading appear since the flag property is set to true. If we take a look at the console, nothing will appear. If I press the button, the heading will be removed. The leave hooks are running in the order you would expect them to. First is the before leave hook, followed by the leave hook, and lastly, we have the after leave hook. Pressing the button once more will trigger the enter events. Once again, they're in the proper order. First is the before enter hook, followed by the enter hook, and lastly, we have the after enter hook. Currently, we're not animating anything. Let's start creating some animations in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to start writing an animation. The animation we're going to go for is a zoom animation. If the element is entering the document, it'll zoom into place. If the element is leaving the document, it'll zoom out. JavaScript is more than capable of handling this sort of animation efficiently. There's a myth that JavaScript is slower than CSS animations. That's not entirely true. There's an API called Web Animations. It's a new API that allows us to perform animations efficiently. It's even more efficient than CSS. It's a newer API that's unrelated to Vue. However, we can use this API with Vue. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the Web Animation API. It's still a fairly new API. I don't expect many of you to be aware of it. This will be a great time to get started with the API. Let's use it with Vue. We'll start with the enter animation. Switch back to the editor. Search for the enter function. The first step to using the Web Animation API is to select an element. An animation can only be played on an element. This requires us to make a selection. Typically, we would use the query selector or getElementById functions to select an element. We don't need to do that since the hook functions are provided with the element. We'll call the animate function on the element object. There's one thing I want to be clear about the element object. The element object we're working with is a normal DOM object. We have full access to the element's properties and methods. The animate function exists only on DOM objects, so it's not specific to Vue. The animate function will animate the element it's being called on. It has two arguments. The first argument is an array of properties to animate. The enter event runs whenever an element is inserted into the document. The properties we're going to animate will zoom the elements in. In the array, we're going to add two objects. Each object can be filled with CSS properties we'd like to add to the element. JavaScript will take care of transitioning between the properties. It'll apply the properties in the first object to the element. It'll then apply the properties in the second object. If we want, we can add as many objects to the array as we'd like. There's no limit. We're going to keep the animation simple. We'll have two objects, one for initial properties of the element, another for the properties the element should have when the animation is over. In the first object, we'll add the transform property. Its value will be the following: scale 3D 0, 0, 0. The scale 3D function will change the scale of the element. That'll make it look really small. We're attempting to make a zoom in animations. It makes sense for the element to be small. We want the element to grow in size. That's what we'll handle next. In the second object, we'll leave it empty. We're finished with the animation. The default scale for an element is 100%. We don't need to scale it back to its original size. The browser will assume we want the element to be its original size. The animate function will set the initial state of the element using the properties we have in the first object. It'll slowly transition the element's CSS properties from the first object to the second object. There's a second argument we can pass onto the animate function. It's an object of settings. This will allow us to change how the animation behaves from the duration to iterability. We're going to set the duration property to 1000. The duration will tell the browser how long to play the animation. The duration must be in milliseconds. The animation we're creating will last for 1 second. We're not going to configure the animation further. This will give us the effect we're looking for. The next step is to tell Vue when the animation is complete. As far as Vue knows, the animation can be playing forever. We can tell Vue the animation is finished by using the done function. However, we don't want to call it until the animation is complete. The animate function will return an object with events we can listen for. Let's assign the animate function to a variable called animation. Then, below it, we'll set the onFinish function to an arrow function. The onFinish event gets emitted when the animation is finished. The value for this must be a function that'll be called when the animation is complete. Inside this function, we'll call the done function to let Vue know we're finished. That'll do it for the enter animation. Let's work on the leave animation. It's going to be the same code. We can copy and paste the code from the enter method to the leave method like so. There's one modification we'll need to make to get the opposite effect. We'll reverse the order of the objects in the array for the animate function. Alright, let's give things a test. Refresh the browser and try pressing the button. The heading will zoom in and out based on the flag property. This animation works great, but we can further optimize it. Vue prefers that you use CSS animations over JavaScript animations. Because of this, Vue will check if you have a CSS animation for the transition. If you don't, it will use your JavaScript animation. Because of this, your animation takes up more resources than it has to. We can tell Vue directly we don't have a CSS animation. Go back to the editor. Inside the transition component with the JavaScript animation, we can bind a property called CSS. We'll set it to false. This property will instruct Vue not to check for a CSS animation. It'll skip right onto using the JavaScript animation. A very simple way to make your animations more efficient and faster. Aside from that, you should be good to go. That's how you can use JavaScript animations in your application. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to use CSS and JavaScript transitions together. We're not forced to use one or the other. You do have the option of using both CSS classes and JavaScript hooks to perform different jobs. For example, you may use them for performing background tasks while the animation is handled with CSS. That's definitely a good way to use both CSS and JavaScript together. In the app component file, we disabled CSS by setting the CSS property to false. By setting it to false, Vue will not add the CSS classes to the elements entering or leaving the document. Vue will ultimately rely on JavaScript hooks to handle the transition. The default value for this property is true. This value allows for both CSS classes and JavaScript hooks to be used. Let's change this to true. Currently, we're not using CSS to transition the elements. On the other hand, we're using JavaScript to create a growing effect. As I mentioned earlier, it's much more efficient to use CSS to handle animations. When you're using both CSS and JavaScript, Vue will use the CSS duration times to set the length of the transition. The done function provided by the hooks is optional. If you don't call the done function, that's perfectly fine. Vue will still know when the transition is complete. Since we're going to allow CSS to handle the animation, we'll clean up the hook functions we created in the previous lecture. In both the enter and leave functions, we're going to comment out the code that creates the JavaScript transition. It doesn't make sense to have two different animations that could potentially cancel each other out. We're going to remove the done parameter from the enter and leave functions. We must remove it. Otherwise, Vue will assume you want to use JavaScript to determine when the transitions are complete. By omitting this parameter, Vue will use the duration in the CSS to know how long the transition lasts. We're leaving behind the log statements. One last thing, we'll add the name property to the transition component. We'll reuse the fade animation we created in CSS. Set this to fade. After making those changes, switch back to the browser with the console opened. Trigger the animations by pressing the button. The elements will transition with the CSS classes. In the console, the hook functions are still logging the same messages. Despite not calling the done function, Vue will know when to call the next hook and when to start the next animation. This is because we're not accepting the done argument. If it's not present in the functions we defined, Vue will use the CSS durations to determine when the animations are complete. This is great because it gives us a whole lot more flexibility. If you want to send a request, update the state, or perform some other asynchronous task, you can do so without worrying about if the transition ends. This approach is how I recommend you use JavaScript hooks. Leave the animation to CSS. We've gone over the different ways to animate an element. You can use either CSS or JavaScript. You can even use both if need be. Vue is very flexible. It's one of the main reasons why developers love the framework so much. You can accomplish the same thing in different ways. It's entirely up to you. Although we've learned the different ways to animate an element, we haven't gone over how to animate a list. So far, we've been animating a single item or a group of items under a conditional directive. What if you wanted to animate a list? You may want to remove things from a list and add things to a list. That's simple enough to do. You already have the knowledge to accomplish something like that. The moment you add animations into the mix, things can get tricky. We can't use the transition component to animate lists. The transition component only works with single elements. If you want to animate a list of items, you'll need to use a different component. I'll talk about that special component in a moment, but first, let's create a list. Inside the app component, we're going to create a new data property. We'll call it numbers. It'll be assigned to an array. We'll put the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to output this list of numbers. You don't have to use numbers. You can use any example you can think of for a list. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. Let's output the list of numbers. Scrolling up to the template block, we're going to comment out the transition component we created in the previous lecture. We don't want it to get in our way. Next, at the bottom of the template block, we'll create an unordered list element. We'll apply the v-for directive to the list item element. The expression will be number in numbers. The alias, number, will represent the value in the current iteration. We'll output the number on each iteration. Inside the element, we'll add an expression for the number alias. We'll also bind the key attribute to the number as well. Remember that the key attribute will help Vue identify which item in the array belongs to which element. It'll help us from running into strange bugs when making changes to the list. Before we continue, we're going to change the font size of the list to 22 pixels inside the style block. It'll make things easier to view. We're also going to set the pointer to cursor. We're going to make it so that the user can delete list items by clicking on them. Setting the cursor to a different icon will indicate that they can do so. This is more of a visual decision rather than a Vue-related one. The next steps are to add an item to the list and remove them when clicked. We'll start with adding numbers. Above the unordered list element, we're going to add a button. We'll listen for a click event on the button. If a click is registered, we'll call the function addItem. This function doesn't exist. We'll have to define it in the methods object of the component. We're going to need two things. First, we need the number to add. Secondly, we're going to need to figure out where to insert the number in the array. We could add it to the end of the list and call it a day. But let's make it challenging by randomizing where the number will be inserted. We'll start by calculating the number to add to the list. We're going to create a variable called num. We'll set it to math.floor, math.random, asterisk 100 plus 1. This expression will generate a random number between 1 and 100. Next, we'll calculate an index. We'll create a variable called index. we'll set it to math.floor, math.random, asterisk, this.numbers.length. This algorithm will randomly select an index inside the array. We'll insert the number to whatever this results in. From here, we can run the splice function on the numbers data property. The splice function can remove values, but we don't want to do that. It's possible to insert values into an array with it. We'll set the first two arguments to index and 0, respectively. The third parameter will be the value we'd like to insert, which will be num. This function will push a number into the array. Let's work on removing the value. In order to remove the value, we'll need the index. Without the index, we won't know which number to remove. Therefore, we'll need to update the expression inside the v-for directive. We'll wrap the first half of this expression in parentheses. This additional syntax is necessary if we want to extract the index. The alias for the index will be index. I know it's been a while since we've had to do this, so let me give you a refresher. You can grab the index of the current iteration by defining it inside these parentheses. The second value is the alias name for the index. We're plainly naming it index. With the index in hand, we can add a click event listener to the list item. We'll call the function removeItem and pass in the index. Next, we'll need to define the function inside the methods object. Inside the function, we'll call the splice function. This time we'll pass in the index we're provided. The number of items to remove is 1. We aren't going to use the third parameter because we aren't trying to add anything to the array. This function should remove whatever item was clicked on in the list. We're finished with writing the function. Let's give things a test. On the page, we will continue to see the same 5 numbers. Clicking on the button will result in a new number added to the list. The number should be random. It will appear in a random location. Adding numbers works fine. Let's test the removal of the numbers. Clicking on any number will result in its removal. This is great. It works as we wanted it to. Now we can begin animating them. I want to animate numbers fading in or out, depending on the action. Back inside the template, we're going to wrap the list tag with a transition group component. You can't use the transition component because it doesn't work with list items. The transition group component is specifically for animating items in a loop. There are not many differences between transition and transition group components. It has the same properties and hooks. It has the enter and leave hooks. You can apply the same set of CSS and JavaScript animations if you wish. One important difference is that you can't set the mode property. You can't set the mode to out-in or in-out. Other than that, we should be fine. We're going to reuse an animation we've defined already. We're going to set the name attribute to fade. The animation we're using will fade the elements in or out based on the action being performed. We don't have to worry about creating the CSS styles because we've already done that in an earlier lecture. Time for another test. We'll refresh the page, which will give us a fresh list. If we were to click on the button, then a new number is generated. It's added onto the list in a random location. The best part is that it animates in. It properly fades in like we want it to. We can even click on any of the list items. The correct item will fade away before being removed. We've got a working solution, but it isn't perfect. We'll discuss the problem in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to fix a problem in our animated list. This transition is almost perfect. One thing you'll notice is that the list items jump. If I add a list item, any numbers below that number will jump down to make room. If I were to remove an item, the numbers above it jump up to compensate for the space. The snappiness isn't appealing at all. Vue will not take care of it for us. We're the ones responsible for handling how sibling elements should move. Go back to the editor. Vue will add a class to elements that are being moved over. It's called the Move class. Just like the other CSS classes, Vue will prepend the name of the transition to the generated class name. In this instance, the class name would be FadeMove. Using this class, we can animate the other items. We're going to define the class in the style block below the other Fade classes. Vue applies the Transform CSS property to the elements that are moving. It'll take care of updating the Transform CSS property. Therefore, we don't need to do anything ourselves. We don't see the effect of Vue transforming the element because the transition property is not applied to it. The transition property is what will make the movement look smoother. We'll define the transition property with a duration of 1 second with a linear motion. The transform property is automatically applied to the list items that get moved. We're following it up by telling the browser it should smoothly transition them rather than jumping immediately. With that set, let's give things a test again. We'll try adding items to the list. As we add them in, not only does the element fade in, the elements below it slide down smoothly. This is because the FadeMove class is being applied to the other elements where we apply the transition property. This doesn't solve all our problems. If I were to remove an element, you'd see that Vue doesn't properly animate the items moving back up. Why is that? This is because the element doesn't have to move during the animation technically. Keep in mind that two things are happening when we add or remove numbers. There's the addition or removal of an element. Then there's the animation itself. When a number is added, Vue will add a list item with that number. That element will occupy space. Therefore, any elements taking up that space have to be moved. During that process, Vue will animate the element by fading it in. We're not increasing its size or changing its height. It already takes up that space. When we remove an element, the opposite happens. The animation plays first, and then the element gets removed. Even though the element is fading away, it still occupies that space. As a result, the other elements don't have to move. Their transform property doesn't have to change. The Move class gets applied during the animation. Once the animation is over, the element gets removed, and the Move class is also removed. Therefore, it never gets the chance to animate the other list items. How do we get the Move class to animate the elements if the item being removed still holds its space? Well, there are a number of ways, but the simplest is by using absolute positioning. Switching back to the editor, we're going to set the position to absolute inside the FadeLeave class. By using absolute positioning, the item fading away will give up its space, forcing the other elements to move up. After making this change, let's test if this works. If I were to click on any list item, the items below it would smoothly move up, taking its space. This is fantastic. We've removed the snapping motion we had before. This makes things smoother and cleaner. We're finished with animating the list. If you're not someone who's very good at animations or just want to save time, you may resort to using a third-party animation library. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a library called animate.css. It's a popular library that comes with predefined animations. They can be used in any application. It's as simple as loading it in and then applying the classes to your elements. However, we do face a problem. The classes generated by Vue don't match the class names in the library. If they don't match, we won't be able to play the animation. We can override this behavior by explicitly setting the class names. Let's try that out. First things first, we'll want to load the Animate library into our app. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a CDN. We're going to load Animate through an external source. Copy the link provided on the page. Make sure you're copying the link with the minified version. After copying the link, open the index.html file in our project. In the Head section, with the other style sheets, link the Animate style sheet. Next, open the App Component file. We're going to apply the animations to the Transition Group component we wrapped around the list. We can begin to use the animations that come with the Animate library. To completely override the names, we can use the following properties. Enter from class. Enter active class. Enter to class. Leave from class. Leave active class. Leave to class. Each class can be explicitly set by defining these properties on the Transition Group component. Vue will not add any additional phrases or names to your class names. You have complete control over the class name. Keep in mind, you can apply these same properties to the Transition component. They behave the exact same way. The Animate library uses CSS animations. We don't need to set a class for every property. The Animate library will take care of setting the CSS properties from beginning to end. That means we can just set the active classes to get the animation working. In fact, I want to highlight that if you were to leave the class name properties empty, then Vue will throw an error at you. We're going to remove every property except for the Enter Active class and Leave Active class classes. The Animate library comes with an abundance of animations. You're free to use any you'd like. For the Enter transition, we're going to use the following: Animate, Animated, Animate, Flip in X. For the Leave transition, we'll use the following classes: Animate, Animated, Animate, Flip out X. The Animated class will set some default stylings for the animations. It's required whenever you want to use any of the animations from the Animate library. Afterward, we can add in any of the animations. A list can be found on the documentation page I linked to earlier. In this example, we're using the Flip animation. All animation classes start with the word animate followed by 2 underscores. Before we give the animations a test, there are 2 things we'll want to adjust. First, we need to add absolute positioning to the class that's applied to the element when it's leaving the document. Otherwise, the other elements will not animate into place like we want them to. Secondly, I want to show you how to override the duration. The default duration is 1 second. In the Style block, add the Animate Flip Out X selector. Set the Position property to Absolute. It's important we're applying this to the Leave transition. The transition for when an element is entering the document doesn't need this. Next, let's look at modifying the duration. The duration of the animation by default is 1 second. The Animate library sets this duration. We can override the duration by changing the CSS property. Let's look at an example. In the Style block, add the Animate Animated class. Set the animation duration property to 1.5 seconds. Both the browser and Vue will use the duration you defined in the Style block. It'll take precedence. Go ahead with testing the transition. The form will flip in and out like we wanted. The other elements are moving smoothly when an element is entering or leaving the page. By defining the class properties on the component, we're able to use any animation library we want, even if it has a different set of class names. Custom names can only be defined on a local level. Unfortunately, there isn't a way to override the names on a global level. Keep that in mind in case you want to go heavy on the animations.